Hey, what's up? If you're talking, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you now.
Awesome. How you doing?
Um, Horrible, but that's just politics now. So
Yeah, it is. Are we live?
yeah,
Oh, hi everybody. Sorry, I should be on a laptop and I should be more perhaps proper, but I'm actually in London and right now we're holding the UK government is hosting this securing our future summit
hmm
for the Ukrainians, and so it's about a 20-minute walk for me. So I thought we could talk and I could head down there and we could see, what's actually going on in person.
sure thing,
If
sure
that's
thing.
of interest to some of your viewers,
Yeah, I'd say so.
um, give us plenty of time to talk about everything else that's going on at least. So it's been a while though, Destiny. How are you doing?
Doing okay. Just surviving one thing at a time.
Yeah, I think that we the expression sort of taking it day by day doesn't even apply anymore. I feel like I have to take it hour by hour
Something
with the
like
rate at
that.
which things change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite sad, I have to be honest, to see the dissolution of the Western world as we sort of come to appreciate it. I think, but you know, um, I'm curious what you think about all this.
Um, I mean, I. That's a very broad question. Give me something more specific. I guess in general, I guess. I mean, there's a lot of feelings. In some sense, I'm confused. I guess. I don't know what it's like. What is your country of origin? Do you say?
Well, I'm half English and Russian, so I'm a weird blend of both sides of this situation, if you want to put it like that.
Gotcha,
So,
gotcha. I'm so in the United States you have a lot of different groups of people, obviously. My mom comes from Cuba, and Cubans were one of the only Hispanic demographics in the United States, or Latino or Hispanic, whatever you call them, I don't know, that were super conservative for a variety of reasons, mainly having to do with a lot of Cubans leaving Castro or leaving Cuba didn't like Castro. A lot of Cubans identify very strongly with conservatives as a result of like the Bay of Pigs, as a result of things that happened with Elian Gonzalez. So Cubans are like very conservative. My mom was in the Air Force and she had very strong feelings about the United States and fighting against Russia and communist China and the Cold War. So my parents grew up as much as you ever can be like a diehard America are the defenders of freedom and liberty around the world. To see my mom tell me that like we have no business being in Ukraine. We shouldn't be doing anything over there. They have biolabs, Stevie. You don't understand. It's like
oh wow,
it's such an
oh wow.
insane turnabout for me that, and that's just yeah. I don't know. To see the Conservative Party, the neocons, who used to be like the hawkish wing, I guess, in the
Yeah.
United States, just become so tepid and weak and
Well,
yeah.
when you have Mike Pence making reasonable points about how outlandish JD Vance was on Friday, you know how far the Overton window, right? The way that we interpret political ideology has shifted.
hmm
I was pretty deplored by Mike Pence in the past, but he comes off as still having basic principles, the basic principles that underline what we in the West, quote unquote, try to preach around the world, and it's the sellout of those principles, I think, by this new Trump administration so much more than this first one, which is, I think, such a kicker for so many people,
hmm
if that makes sense. I knew the meeting was going to, if we go specific to the meeting, for example, I don't know what your viewers and you might have felt about it, but I knew that there was an inevitability that it would derail. What I didn't expect was for it to be as fast and as hard, if that makes intense as it did. I do have some concerns or issues with the way Zelenskyy tried to navigate it, but ultimately it was Vance who, for me, was the catalyst in so much of it. Trump doesn't really care about Ukraine. If he can get a deal, then he'll do it, but he doesn't really give a shit. Vance has an actual, I think, antipathy towards Zelensky personally and Ukraine's whole, what this stands for in his idea of MAGA America. And I think also he used it as an opportunity to really leverage his brand, right?
Yeah,
Because
this
many
is
people,
This
People
is
see him as the new MAGA adoptee, right? He'll inherit the MAGA movement and sort of, people are saying he'll be the next president in 2029. Perish the thought, right? But yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about Vince. Maybe one thing I don't like is the lowering of standards on Trump, though. If you had an adult who was lounging near a pool and 25-year-old guy drinking a beer, and a child who's 3 years old were to waddle by him and fall into a pool in front of him, and he were to just sit there, drinking beer, watching the child drown, and somebody were to come by and go, "Yo, what the fuck?" Nobody would accept as an excuse for the guy to be like, what am I going to do? I don't like this idea that Trump gets an infinite pass on being such a weak, feckless, worthless leader just because, LOL, it's Trump. Like, what is the point?
I don't think that's not what I'm saying.
Well, no, but I mean, like, think,
clear,
because Trump himself said, I think, like, what are you going to do? They're a nuclear superpower. Okay, so is the United States. Why is it that we approach international negotiation against Russia like we're these weak, cucked, spineless fucks that can't do anything? Like, we have no power at all. Like, why would Ukraine even ask the United States to help settle a peace deal if the U.S. is just going to go, well, I don't know, World War III nuclear weapons, LOL, and that's it? Like, why wouldn't we say that exact same thing if they invaded Poland? Like, what's the,
Yeah, but I think you're trying to apply principles to someone who's just never going to huff them. Trump's never going to be like that, so it's pointless even trying to exercise that thought, isn't it?
Well, sure, but then the next question is, like, how brutally and how quickly can Europe eject the United States of America from its vision of a coherent, I guess, like, world policy? Because if that's
this is my main focus, which is what Europe does now. Look, no offense, but I am first and foremost European, and I love, the good Americans like yourself and the ones who were protesting Vance in Vermont to the point that he had to get the fuck out of his hotel and go to undisclosed location. I love that. Go Americans, like that, right? I love that. Stand up and fight. But at the end of the day, we have to, at this point, Europe needs to get off its fucking arse, stop being shocked, stop being outraged, stop being triggered, and we need to be pragmatic and action orientated. We have to treat every future situation as a worst case scenario now with the United States. I hate to say that, but we do, because at the drop of a hat, Trump can pull the plug on so much shit. Yeah. And this is a huge critique I have of the Europeans, which is we have been complacent and entitled for far too long. The one thing I do agree with Trump is that the US has provided security assurances for the Europeans, which did freeload, and to our own impediment, right? To our own detriment.
How do you freeload? How, though? The United States gets a lot out of access to European markets, out of the ability to trade.
I'm talking purely in a security sense.
Well, but we can't. But security is not just for security. I agree with you 100% that Europeans are a bunch of horrible, worthless freeloaders if we're only talking about security. But we're not only talking about security. We're talking about the fact that I can order a product from India, from China, from South Africa. I can order anything from anywhere in the world, and I never have to stop and think: is my vessel that I ordered something is shipping on going to be commandeered, or is there like trade routes that are blocked right now? Like, I've never had to think about this as an American in my entire life, and the fact that Europe has been able to develop as economically heavily as it has in the shadow of World War II. It recovered tremendously. Germany today is a manufacturing superpower. All of these things have happened under the guidance of the American security umbrella. And it's benefited the United States as well. It's not like when we separate, it's not like you guys are going to be better off for it. You're going to be worse off for it. And America's going to be worse off for it. Everybody's just made worse off by this happening, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction there, right? I'm the first to indicate that the role of international aid, be it foreign aid or developmental aid or whatever type of aid, right? That was very much at the benefit of the United States. It led to the three of the most powerful and prosperous economies in history: Germany, South Korea, and Japan, all of which are America's biggest trading partners. So, of course, but I think there's a slight distinction between the historical comparisons and the here and now in terms of that the Europeans have been a little bit too negligent in their investments. So I'm crossing the road. Negligent in terms of their own security capacity, right? We neglected our militaries to such an extent, particularly in the past 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And it wasn't just me who said this. Joseph Borrell, who's a former foreign minister of the EU, said very simply, the Europeans have been too long reliant on US security assurances, cheap energy from Russia, and big markets from China. So the point I'm making is that Europe needs to get the hell up, wake up, and we need to take ownership. My concern is that whilst we have the capacity to do that, we always seem to fall back into this lapse of judgment that actually maybe we don't need to be too worried about it. But like, it's make or break time, guys. We've got to do something about it. And also the time horizon, right? By the time it takes for Europe to get shit together, it's still time for Putin to remilitarize and be a genuine threat, right? I don't like the villainization of Russia in every form, but unfortunately, it's run by a guy who wants to see the destruction of democracy and Western values, which Europe, as a European, I value. So I don't know. I mean, I could continue, but
I mean, I guess
sure
the
you've got plenty
issue
to
is
say.
that, yeah, I mean, the issue is that not to, now I will be very American, okay, you fucking Europeans. Listen, when you guys all have armies, all you do is kill each other, okay? You guys are doing it constantly. Prior to World War II, prior to World War I, you give every European country an army, you got another 100 years war, you got another Fourth Reich, you've got more people fighting all the time constantly. I think that after the fall of the Soviet Union, people were worried that Europe would fall into that trend of everybody fighting each other again. And I think especially in the Balkans, Yugoslavia, like we were like, oh boy, here we go. But it didn't really happen. And I think that the United States providing this like friendly security umbrella where people are like, well, the U.S. runs shit militarily, so what are we going to do? I guess develop economically and trade. I feel like that paradigm is better for the United States, obviously. It's better for Europe, I would say. Like, you're talking about the benefits of Europe needs to militarize. When you say Europe needs to militarize, you said you're half Russian, half British. What does that even mean now? Because the UK is not even part of the European Union. So is it going to be the own British army? You're never having an EU army, right? I think that the right and the left Eurosceptics would literally go into seizures if the EU started to form some kind of like military. So there wouldn't be a coherent. Really? You think so?
Well, I think, look, I mean, the events on Friday are such a inflection point, right? I've made several videos of this on the channel and stuff, I don't know if I can mention that, but like, it's a paradigm shift, mate. It's a fundamental change in everything that we in the West have taken for granted. And the biggest tragedy I find about this is MAGA Americans are so far in with their idolization of Trump and what he stands for, or his idea of what America will be great again, that they're losing the forest for the trees, right? That they are forgetting that the long-term consequences of the destruction of Western unity, trust, and respect, it comes at a huge cost ultimately to America. Sure, you can save money, but ultimately the net negatives are there, plain to see. But because they don't want to fund Europe anymore, and it's like Twitter's such a cesspit now that sort of you've got Americans just saying fuck you to everything about Europe's a shithole and all this sort of stuff, and it's like, hang on a minute. Some of you Americans are the ones who constantly say how much you love Europe because of its culture, history, and so on. So they're so willing to support Trump that they're even willing to slag off the thing that they used to say how much they love it. So it's just bad. I think the one thing that Europe's going to have to really think about is, well, having to play Trump a little bit, they're going to have to really appeal to his interest, transactional approach to foreign policy, right? In the case of Europe has we can't do everything at once. There is so much that America provides that we just don't have the capacity to replicate immediately. And I'm thinking predominantly sort of logistics aspects, a radar, intelligence, that sort of thing, right? America provides such an overarching security architecture for the Europeans. We have to focus on one thing at a time. And the British, to your point, the UK aren't even in the EU. How's that going to work? Interoperability is a problem. We've got issues with manpower shortages. We've got a problem with the willingness of people to sign up to fight in hypothetical scenarios. There's a fuck ton of shit. So unfortunately, I think the Europeans are still going to have to bite the bullet and do some kind of deals with the Trump administration on what he considers to be beneficial to America. They're going to have to drop this values-based approach towards American interests and clearly put it in, this is why you should deal with us, not the Chinese or the Russians. You know what I mean? This is the zero-sum game we seem to be in. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, but like it's...
Listen, all I'm saying is, okay, 250 years ago, France helped us rebel before, okay? Why don't you guys just help us out again, okay? We got to get rid of Trump. We got to get rid of this administration. Wouldn't that be the path of least resistance? No, I mean, I guess it's just sad that we're all just supposed to accept a fundamentally worse world for everybody. Like, that's just, I don't know. Like, the idea that, like...
But what choice do we have? If you try to throw out Trump, that's not exactly democratic, is it? I would love nothing more to see the end of this administration.
Nothing that Trump is doing right now is democratic. I don't think Trump cares about democracy or any part of that.
Yeah, but it's more about the people, right? You would have a literal civil war in America if the anti-Trump crowd tried to get Trump to be removed from office, right? That would lead to anarchy in America because it's like the majority of Americans voted for Trump, whether you like it or
Possibly,
not.
but I mean, like that. I mean, we could be looking at a similar situation in Europe as you are right now with Europe and American skepticism, right? Where at some point you have to take a hard stand because on the current path that we're on, the trajectory we're on is just I don't even want to say a slow erosion of our democratic freedoms. This current administration, this gets into a lot of domestic legal stuff, but has just totally acted with willful disregard of the law and everything. So, yeah, it's pretty insane. It's pretty insane here. Like that, we might already be on that path and we just don't realize it yet. Or 5 years from now, we'll be like, oh, how could we not notice that we were on an inevitable, crash course to some kind of, horrible domestic event.
Well, think about it, right? What has happened in 5 weeks of U.S. administration? 5 weeks. Mm-hmm. I knew, again, that this sort of stuff would happen. You would see a dissolution, but not a complete disintegration. Like the unraveling is remarkable, I have to be honest. And I don't know. I want to get into the specifics a little bit because I'm curious what you thought about individuals. As I said, I deplore Vance even more than Trump. But Marco Rubio, I think, is a very interesting case because the way he was sitting, I don't know if you saw this, but the way he was like hunched up in the seat in the Oval Office, it looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him up. He was, he's Cuban American. He was not exactly. Well, you can relate to that, right? You're not shy to share your opinions and feelings about a situation.
Yeah, I mean do you ever see that video when Saddam Hussein first comes into power in Iraq, and he starts calling up random party members that he's like accusing of being traitors to the party? And in the middle of this, where he's calling out random people, one guy, I think, gets up and he's like, "Long live Saddam Hussein, long live," and everybody starts getting up and saying it so that everybody's kind of like on his good side. When you look at how Trump runs things, it's basically like that. Rubio, I don't know how much you know about Marco Rubio's history in the U.S. Rubio is a fucking hawk. This is a hawkish person who is, I would say, just looking at him and his primary performance in 2016, is solidly a neocon. And to see him now have to suck up to Trump and everything else, all of these people have had to fall in line. If you do not fall in line with the Trump agenda, he will destroy you, whether that means taking you to court and suing you, as he's done with pollsters that he doesn't like, as he's done with media companies who publish interviews that he doesn't like. Even if they're not about him, he's doing it, I think, with CNN and a Kamala Harris interview that he didn't like. He will sick the DOJ on you, which he's already shown, because Pam Bondi and Bovee, the Attorney General and the Deputy AG, are now are investigating people that won't follow orders from the Trump admin. They've already done this with regards to the case being dismissed against Eric Adams in New York. Or he'll just destroy you from the party. He'll talk shit about you constantly. He'll tell people they're going to primary you, we're going to vote you out. So you have to play ball with Trump, or he will apply like 7 different dimensions of pressure on you. And Rubio's just in that trap, basically. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think he was one of the least problematic, and I use that wording very specifically, individuals who was,
Rubio was a shining star in those cabinet picks, and it hurts to say that, but he was absolutely a shining star because he's somebody that doesn't fucking hate America. He was like one of the only people that was like, oh, this is a guy that at least likes his country. I can tell, But yeah, he was like the only one. Yeah.
Yeah, who has reasonable grounds. I had some limited hope about Kellogg as well, General Kellogg as the envoy towards Ukraine, right?
Okay.
But at the end of the day, the guy is only capable of doing what hand he's dealt, which is, well, Trump's. So not ideal. But yeah, no, Marco Rubio's point is, I think the immediate tweet he made, sort of sucking up even more and placating Trump's behavior and Vance's behavior. So I'm in Belgravia Square, which is there's a lot of foreign money here, so lots of Lamborghinis and stuff. If you heard the noise, but yeah. So I mean, it's just really, it's really just tragic to see that even the standout guy, as you say, is sort of not willing to take a moralistic stand. So I don't know. I mean,
you can't. If you do, you get fired. You get primaried. You get kicked out. Like that's what's happened. Like when Doge was tearing through federal agencies, like there were 2 security guards trying to stop Doge guys going into I believe it was the Treasury, and they just fired both of them. They get
well, speaking of Doge,
yeah.
Musk of it. What was Zelenskyy doing not wearing a suit, man? That's outrageous, right? It's not like Musk or Narendra Modi or Winston Churchill in 1943 haven't worn a suit or anything.
Yeah, what's his name?
That's what most
when
matters.
Arafat showed up to sign was it the Oslo Accords? When Arafat showed up at Camp David or whatever, he didn't have a fucking, he had his military uniform on even.
Yeah, he was wearing fatigues. Yeah, exactly. So no, that's what I love about the
So performative.
unconditional supporters of Trump, is that they will pick up on literally the most inconsequential aspects, sort of the fact that Zelensky's not in a suit. Is that really the and obviously the guy who asked the question in the whole thing, you know, do you own a suit? That was clearly a plan. I think that was all deliberately done to trigger Zelenskyy, or to, I mean, very simple. I don't know. Do you think it was staged, the whole thing? Do you think it was just an ambush?
Honestly, the thing that makes me feel like it was staged the most is when Trump said, I'm glad I let this go on so long so you could see or whatever. That was a really weird comment to make. When I heard him say that, I was like, wait, what do you mean you're glad that you let this go on so long so people could see? See what? Yeah, I don't know. It feels stupid, yeah.
I didn't know he said that. When did he say that? Near the end?
Yeah, it was near the end. Yeah, Trump said, and I'm glad we let this go on for so long or whatever. I'm glad I let this go on. Yeah, that was a crazy comment to me. It's like, Jesus, but.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I don't know. I feel like obviously they had an agenda, and I've vacillated so much in the past 48 hours. I ended up giving up my Friday night because of what happened. I was just so caught up, you know, covering it on YouTube and other social media and stuff. And I vacillated thinking sort of that this was staged, it wasn't, but ultimately sort of, either if it partially was, the implications are so significant, I don't think it would have mattered either way, to be honest. I think that if it had just been between Trump and Zelenskyy, maybe you're going to disagree with this point, but I don't think it would have transcended into what it did.
Probably not, but I think that one issue that people have, I don't know if we'll disagree on this. I don't think there is any deal that Zelenskyy could or should sign that doesn't include security guarantees. What a waste of fucking time, in my opinion, to put pen to paper on something that doesn't have a security assurance from the United States or anybody in the West. And it sounds like when Zelenskyy was going to the White House that Trump had no intention whatsoever of providing any of those security guarantees. So, I mean, privately, maybe it wouldn't have turned into a shouting match or whatever, but like, I don't know if they would have walked away signing anything, unless it would have been the weakest deal of like just the outline of a thing that meant nothing anyway.
Yeah, no, I think so. I actually don't disagree with you on that. I think what's more interesting is the framing by which the Ukrainian delegation or representatives tried to frame it as though it was sort of the revised version but somehow improved. Yeah, so there's lots of this sort around here. Sorry about that. Yeah, so it's just really sad to see that's the extent by which, you know, the Ukrainians have to sort of try and make it look as though they've won the US delegation round, right? It's and to be honest with you, though, I'm not entirely sure what a backstop would look like. This is a popular word that is used in international relations, but it never really has a clear sort of definition. Like, sort of the US continues to be present through a reduced NATO presence in Eastern Europe or something like that, whilst the Europeans take up the peacekeeping front lines in actual Ukraine. Like, it's sort of to properly roadmap or blueprint out, if that makes sense, how it would physically be working in the region. It's very hard to imagine, to be honest.
Well, I think the reason why it's hard to imagine, I don't think it's actually that hard to imagine. I think that when somebody, I don't know how big you are in business stuff, when somebody asks me a question and they have a difficulty, or if you have like difficulty feeling what you should do with a particular life decision or a particular like business decision, a lot of the times the problem is a first principles problem. You don't actually know, like, well, what are you about? What are you trying to do? You know, on a really big macro level. When you don't have those questions figured out, every little minor decision becomes very difficult. I think the reason why it's hard to envision what does a U.S. backstop look like, what does any of this deal look like, it's because Trump has no comprehensive vision, or at least he hasn't expressed a comprehensive vision on anything, on like what is the U.S.'s role in Europe? What should a final resolution between Ukraine and Russia look like? What does future involvement of the United States look like in enforcing? Like any of these broader questions, just the broad question of like, what is the United States role in Europe and the rest of the world? I don't think anybody knows the answer to that right now, right? You've got a U.S. president who says they don't want to be involved in European security, but they want to own one of the most hot pieces of land in the Middle East, the Gaza Strip. Like, what is the underlying philosophy that's guiding both of these decisions besides chaotic, random, like, dipshittery? Like, I have no fucking idea, you know?
Well, no, it's funny. It's a paradox, isn't it? Because on the one hand, Trump's talking about isolationism and disengagement from U.S. commitments or activity in the international system, but at the same time, he's talking about physically occupying and presiding over a piece of land that has no strategic or materialistic value. No offense to the Gaza Strip, but it would be, well, he wants to turn it into a Riviera. Okay, sounds like a stand-up form of foreign policy for the Trump administration. But also, I think it shows you just how much Trump sees the world through great power politics, right? He sees things through might is right, and the only way to really get what you want is through show of force. And that expendable states, be them Ukraine or any other small state, they're just that. They are pawns in the greater strategic game. And that's why he's, prioritized talking to Modi over even the British or the French. He's prioritized talking to the Russians and ignoring Ukraine. And it's this stark shift from the Biden administration. I mean, Biden couldn't be any more of a multilateralist. He couldn't be any more of a guy who talks about international cooperation and values, and whatever you think about his hypocrisy or inconsistency in policy versus rhetoric. It couldn't be more of a 180, I guess is what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, what do you think happens next then?
I can't predict. It's like when people ask me, like, why do you think this guy's doing this, or what's going on with it? I have no idea. I can't predict anything. I have absolutely no idea. Everything just feels like chaotic randomness to me. Like, there's a world where tomorrow somebody shows Trump a deep fake of Putin calling him a big sissy pussy baby, and Trump says, we're actually going to be shipping nuclear weapons to Ukraine so they can defend themselves because we think Ukraine is the most important country in the world to maintain its safety. Like, I have no idea. I truly cannot predict. Nothing in this administration makes sense to me. I don't know. Like, why are we fighting with Mexico and Canada? I don't know. Why are we tariffing our friends more than China or anybody else? Like, I don't know. I have no idea. How do you view the guiding principles of this administration? How do you ever make a prediction on what you think comes next, I guess, in the current Trump administration?
I think that it's the one thing about Trump you can predict is that he will be unpredictable. I know that sounds a bit like, what the hell are you talking about? But in the sense of, that's why I think the Europeans are best placed to not take anything for granted anymore. Mm-hmm. You have to go on the notion that worst case scenario is most likely what could happen. We are seeing the unraveling of the international order that has benefited the United States and the West for the past 80 years, and particularly the past 30 years. And it's up to Europe now to decide whether we want to actually take control and ownership of that, or whether we're just going to seep back into our old ways of doing it. And I think that, again, that means realism it doesn't mean you have to sell out your principles completely, right? The EU is a pole for soft power, right? We are, not whether, again, it's hypocrisy, double standards of the past, but a lot of people look to the EU as upholding things around climate change or human rights and democracy and things like that. And the US is not doing that at the moment. So the EU has to balance.
Okay, you're saying a thing, and I take issue with this. I hear a lot of people say this. Realism. We have to be, we have to look at real power politics. We got to look at all these things. Why is it that is only ever applied to Russia? Why is that never applied to the United States? Like, why is it never the case that, so for instance, Trump will say any crazy fucking outlandish thing, and all of the maggots, will crawl to slurp up whatever falls out of his body, saying like, oh, well, that's how he negotiates and blah, blah, blah. Why couldn't Trump tomorrow say, actually, we want the war in Ukraine to end, and if it doesn't, we're firing nukes on Moscow on the 1st. We're nuking Moscow. Now, obviously, that would be an insane thing to say, but why is it that Trump can only say insane things against our allies? Why can't it be on Russia for once to think like, okay, well, fuck, the U.S. is kind of fucking crazy. Would Trump do it? I'm not sure. Maybe I should proceed with caution. There is no caution whatsoever on the Russian side. The only roadblocks that this administration seems to throw up are in front of allies. Why is it, I'm curious, or maybe I'm missing something. Can you give me a single time where Russia has had to stop and think like, ooh, maybe Trump's going to fuck us really hard on this one, as opposed to right now, it just seems like they're getting every single possible thing they want from the U.S. administration?
Well, I mean, keep in mind that this U.S. administration has only been in 6 weeks, and we did see a fair amount of that from Biden as well, right? Biden, there's been a lot of rhetoric about bringing Ukraine into NATO and that they would always be part of the NATO alliance. But in reality, the Europeans are not on board with that because Ukraine is not ready to join NATO. They are not on the same economic or military level. The interoperability is a problem. Corruption is still a thing in Ukraine.
Sure,
So
but the support for Ukraine was unequivocal from Biden, the biggest.
yeah, but it's rhetoric.
Well, no, it wasn't. Shipping weapons, making intelligence available, like trying to provide as much material support as possible.
Yeah, but that's a band-aid, isn't it? That doesn't solve the systemic threat that Ukraine feels.
True, but I mean,
a
like,
solution
but
to the situation, right?
Yeah, but they're not in NATO, and deploying U.S. troops formally against Russia is something that historically we just don't do, I think for decent reason. But I'm just saying that, like, at the very least, like, Biden was a thorn, if nothing else, it was a huge thorn in Russia's side, whereas Trump seems eager to capitulate to any Russian demand.
I think it goes back to the sort of one argument has been put that the US doesn't need to stoop to such levels as the Russians do. They don't need to be as primitive in making such threats to force the capitulation of the Kremlin. I mean, the US
true,
has...
but that's only when you're willing to exercise soft power, which the United States also doesn't do. The reason why you don't have to capitulate in a barbaric way is because you've got larger ways to bully people around. But who are we bullying? What did we just announce? Didn't we announce tariffs on the EU? We've got our tariffs coming online for Canada and Mexico. We're using our soft power against all of our allies. I don't know why.
No, I know. I think it's also because you just don't want. I think it's a reputational aspect that the US doesn't want to be sort of criticized as doing Putin's policies, right? But there are a couple of examples where the US has really put forward some suggestions, right? You can talk about the $350 billion, which is of Russian finances, which the Americans have suggested multiple times they would acquire, and haven't, because they knew that really is a red line for the Russians. Also, when Putin was making threats of, when he did them partial quote unquote, which was full mobilization in 2022, that was Putin really, I think late 2022, about 5-6 months into the war, just after Ukraine had made the counteroffensive in Kharkiv, the Russians were really on the back foot. He was making, renewed nuclear threats. He was being very, that was Putin as rattled as I've seen him in a long time.
For sure.
And I think that was because the Americans were really beginning to up the ante, and you could see it paying dividends in terms of the military operations that the Ukrainians were managing.
Sure.
But then obviously the Russians dug in.
Putin having to flee Moscow for that mini 2-day coup from Prigozhin.
The mutiny from Wagner. Yes, the mutiny from Wagner. Yeah. Well, that was obviously a dumpster fire in terms of for some reason Prigozhin thinking that if he got on a plane a few months later, he wouldn't be then taken out in the air by Russian whatever it was.
Really? I thought it was a DEI pilot. I thought that's why that plane crashed. But yeah, maybe it was maybe he got Navalny'd, I guess. Yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know. The thing is, I just don't know what this administration wants. Like, I'm curious, in a final Ukrainian-Russian settlement, I see right now, this feels disgusting to say, but I see Ukraine having to give up every occupied territory right now, essentially, like all of the southeast, basically. Probably assurances given to Russia that Ukraine won't be allowed to join NATO, or maybe probably not even the European Union for the next 10 or 20 years. And what is Russia sacrificing? Like, what is Russia giving up for this peace deal?
Well, nothing. I mean, I'll put it this way, right? There's a distinction between what I would prefer and what is more realistic. I'm also just outside Lancaster House, everybody. So this is where the European leaders are meeting, or have been for the past 2-3 hours. As you can see, it's completely fenced off. It's lovely. It's sunny evening here in London. But yeah, I just wanted to come down. You've got camera crews and there's a Ukraine flag, obviously, and up. So yeah. Anyway, I'm going to wander around and see what we can find, but it's all very fenced off. Counter-terrorism, police and everything around. But anyway, so no, I think that, look, I've got my preference, which is obviously 91 borders. Ukraine is a sovereign state, and the international rules-based order that we've grown accustomed to is respected. But I also think that there's a reality, which is that unless the United States is willing to support Ukraine unconditionally and unlimitedly in terms of timescale, I cannot see physically how the Ukrainians can take back the control of the territories that the Russians currently are in. The Russians are facing an economic pressure if the Russian economy collapses and Putin faces internal demise, then that might be a little bit more of a potential factor. But as it stands, the Europeans do not have the military capacity to support Ukraine in that endeavor. They just don't have the military output. We'd have to reallocate a significant amount of our resources and economy towards wartime production. And I don't think the Europeans are willing to do that, despite what they say about supporting Ukraine throughout everything. And so if we're not willing to do that, then we don't just, without the US, we just don't have that same amount of capacity. And therefore, the likelihood that Ukraine can somehow in-house develop their defensive and offensive capabilities to retake back the territories unilaterally, right, in terms of just manpower, that's another issue, that Ukrainians do have a manpower disadvantage. I just can't see how they realistically are going to retake the four oblasts. So sort of, do they cut their losses, accept that the four oblasts are lost, and they just double down in terms of developing security assurances along the existing line of contact?
Yeah, but what security?
I mean, take care of that.
I guess the issue is basically that, yeah, I mean, it's a full Russian victory. I don't know what the point is of I would prefer the U.S. just not even be involved at all then. Like, I feel like there's a worst case scenario, which is the U.S. negotiating a bad, or like this is worse than a worst case scenario. Like, why would the United States be involved in negotiating such an absolute and utter and total surrender? Why are we even involved? What's the point? Like, I don't know. It just seems so stupid to me. Like, I don't know.
I think that's the argument of people. I think that's the argument of people who are more, I don't know, pro-Putin or Putin apologists. But in that sort of, the Americans should never have got involved as much as they have, because the likelihood that, we either had to give them Ukraine everything from the beginning, or give them, basically it was Biden's inconsistency and reluctance to be committed, like either commit fully, but he was still holding back. The only time the Ukrainians earned javelins, they earned ATACMS, but each time it came too late, too little, too late. And by that point, the Russians were dug in with positions, and therefore it was a pointless thing to do. And so that's what frustrated a lot of pro-Ukraine. Right?
I think there's two things going on. So retrospectively, I think we kind of forget this, but I think, and my Ukrainian friends are going to kill me, but I think it was fair in the beginning to be a little bit slow, because even though Ukraine is seen as this like really noble, good nation now, and I agree with the view, and Zelensky's an awesome guy, Ukraine did have a whole bunch of problems related to corruption and everything else prior to 2014, for sure, and even prior to 2022. So the idea that they're getting invaded and now we're just going to, wait, are you still here, or did you get totally DC'd? Oh, fuck, he's totally disconnected.
No, I'm here. Sorry. My camera went off for some reason. So anyway, I'm here. Sorry, I'm listening.
Wait, hold on. It's lagging a little bit.
Have I lost you now? No, you're here.
No, I can hear you. It's just a little laggy. Maybe new position almost?
How about that? Is that better?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm saying that, like, in the beginning, I could understand not
opening.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. In the beginning, I could understand not giving
Sorry,
everything.
you were saying?
In the beginning, I could understand not giving everything to Ukraine because we had no idea how they would utilize it, right? So, I'm a little bit sympathetic in the first few months, at least, or half year or whatever, of like, okay, well, let's see how they are able to fight. You wouldn't want to turn over a bunch of military stuff, and they end up getting steamrolled anyway because they just don't have the ability to mobilize. Like, nobody really knew what that war would look like, despite so many opinions on both sides of it. But then after a couple years, I think that the issue that you ran into was Republicans in the United States just didn't want to support Ukraine anymore. And it became a fight on every single piece of legislation then, whether or not we were going to greenlight more support to Ukraine started to become tied to like border bills in the United States of America. And it was just like ridiculous. So I think that, I don't know, like I feel like if you're a country and you're fighting with somebody else, the idea that the US is like in the shadows, is like behind your opponent, that should be like a really scary thing. But right now it just seems like a really cucked thing. Or even it's like it's like good for you. Oh, cool, the US is involved. So we know that whoever we're fighting against is now going to be super fucked and cucked because the US isn't going to want to be involved in anything and they're going to hold them back the whole time. Like, I don't know, it just feels really shitty to me. When I say I don't think the US should be involved now, it's not because I don't think they shouldn't have ever been involved. It's because now it seems like the US is, Russia has to play real power politics and the US has to play like real cuckold politics where we can't do anything and they can do everything. It's like, the fuck? I don't know.
Well, this is the problem, right? anti-Ukrainian voices will say that, Russia's winning and the Americans and NATO can't even beat Russia. But sort of they miss completely the point, which is that the Americans aren't actually involved. They're sending weapons indirectly, which is not the same as American forces actually fighting Russia directly. But we wouldn't ever want to get to that point because that does lead to, well, Armageddon. So sort of the United States is having to play the bigger player by not getting as involved as it could otherwise too. It would, because it would crush Russia, right? You've got 35 countries or whatever, 32 in NATO. And well, half of them are the same size economically as Russia versus let alone the United States, which is what, 20 times. So yeah, it's an unfair answer from the beginning, right? It's not a fair argument. It's a disingenuous argument from the beginning, rather. So that is part of it. But I also think that as I said, I think it goes back to the sort of the tug of war between what some people within Washington wanted to do versus what others felt was too scary. That, the fear of mad is very much there. And so I think that pulls a lot of Democrats, maybe not so much some of the neocon Republicans or something, into being like, well, we don't want to get too involved. We shouldn't give Ukraine too many weapons because that might antagonize the Russians. But then by not doing so, they're worsening the situation long term because the Ukrainians are still going to fight, but they're just going to be at a disadvantage and the whole thing just breaks down. You know what I mean? So it got to the point, I think, halfway through the war, at least for the past 3 years, where at that point, no matter how much the Americans gave Ukraine stuff, it was never going to be enough because there was always that sort of hand pulling them back a bit. You know what I mean? Sort of, they were dragging their feet still even a little bit. So yeah, I think at this point it's not salvageable. I just don't see how, unless Trump does a 180 again, and it's like, yes, actually, I'm going to support Ukraine completely because I feel I've been fucked over by Putin. Ukraine can somehow come out of this on top. It just doesn't seem realistic, as much as it pains me to say that.
Here's the biggest issue that I have, and I think we understood this at some point historically, right? When we talk about appeasement, right? When people say things like, we're scared of World War III, we're scared of nuclear whatever, wouldn't it be better to stop this type of behavior or to show Russia that it can't act this way because they know that that's going to happen rather than kind of like tempting them into doing it over and over again? Because wouldn't those exact same arguments apply if Russia decided to invade any of the, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland? Like if Russia wanted to invade any NATO country, why wouldn't those same arguments apply? Why would they expect, any U.S. presence to be involved in any of these things as well? Because wouldn't those exact same arguments be used? I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this is the problem. That you don't want to fall too much into the direction of appeasing someone that will exploit you, but equally you don't want to push it to such an extent that you can't come back from it, right? So I don't know. I'll give you a personal example of my own internal dilemma about this. In the early days of the war, there was the discussion about the NATO no-fly zone, enforced no-fly zone by NATO.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not sure about that because if the Russians and the NATO did engage in the air, that is a trigger potentially for, heightened escalation. The Russians can claim that NATO shot them down, vice versa, etc. And so the point I'm making is that once you go too far, you can't come back from it.
Yeah, but
and I think that's the restraint thing of the Biden administration, right?
Yeah, so I don't like this thinking because I feel like this thinking legitimizes the saber rattling of nuclear winter. Let's say that were to happen, and I used to repeat these arguments, but like, let's say that you do get this. The U.S. comes in and they big dick it, and they say, no fly zone over Ukraine. End of story. And Russia's like, well, fuck you, obviously. You're not going to no-fly zone. What are you going to do? We're going to start having Russian and American jets shooting each other. And then Russia deploys air forces, and the U.S. says, yeah, we are. And the U.S. starts shooting stuff down. What's Russia going to do? Like, Putin, for all the hate that I might have for Putin and anybody else, I don't think Putin is an actual, maniac who's like, all right, I'm going to start fucking nuking everything. Fuck this. Like, I think at some point, Russia has to say, well, the U.S. is an illegitimate fighter. They're involved in this. This is terrible. We're going to pull back. Do we really expect, the U.S. is not firing the first nukes, right? We know that. Is Russia going to fire the first nukes for Ukraine? I don't think so. And it sends a strong message. You're like, okay, well,
no head of state wants to be the first. No. I mean, no head of state wants to be the first to launch to press the red button. The reputation and legacy that leaves behind, right? Putin is wanting to be seen as the savior and restorator of Russia, not its absolute destruction. So it goes against everything that he stands for. But the problem I have is that Russia is more of a rogue state than, say, China. So, for example, when the Chinese and when the North Koreans and the Russians signed the strategic partnership in June, the Chinese were very quiet about that because they don't actually want it. They don't want the spotlight on Eastern Asia because, well, that brings attention to their activities in the South China Sea, in Taiwan. They're quite happy to see the chaos well, maybe not complete chaos, but they're quite happy to see Russia weakened because it means Russia is more reliant on China, and China can effectively, take all of their resources and use them as a bit of a vassal/client state. So the Chinese were not happy when they signed that strategic partnership because it brings an unnecessary amount of recklessness and unpredictability to the international system that China is a part of. You can talk about there being an anti-Western axis, right? The Economist likes to talk about the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, the North Koreans, but the Chinese are always the slight anomaly there because they are so much bigger and integrated with the system in a way that the Russians and the North Koreans are not. The Americans would never classify.
I feel like China understands and uses soft power so much better too than I guess the U.S. now and Russia as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, they're gradualists. They think in decades, whilst we think in minutes at this point. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that the no leader wants to be the first to launch the nukes, and therefore, though technology has changed, and my biggest concern always comes back to specifically tactical nukes, because if you have a warhead that has a very low yield on a tactical nuclear weapon, you can launch that into the Sea of Azov, the bit east of Crimea, and that would be a big symbolic strike, which wouldn't necessarily have any damage in terms of infrastructure, wouldn't kill anyone, but it would be such a show of force by the Russians to show you are really pushing us now, that that's still quite a scary concept. So
yeah, but think about what we're saying afterwards. What we're saying, the statement that we've made, the rules that we're writing right now for the international order are: if you have nuclear weapons, you can always be the aggressor, regardless of the justification for war, because we are too scared to fight with you. So why would Russia, if they saw an opportunity to flip Poland into another Belarus, into another whatever they want to turn Ukraine into another Georgian annexation, into another Moldova Transnistria situation, who's to stop Russia from doing it? Because all these same arguments are still here. I feel like we're just running up the stairs in our tower, fighting floor by floor by floor, until at some point we're going to have to take a stand up because, okay, well, fuck, we can't, Russia's up to Germany now, or they're up to France now. Okay, well, fuck, I guess we got to do something now. And it's like, well, fuck, we should have just done this when it was Georgia, or at least when it was Ukraine. Why are we waiting so long? Do we think that Russia's going to say, well, I'm glad that the saber rattling worked here and I was able to get every single thing I wanted to, and now I'm happy and I'm just going to stop right here. This is chill. This is cool. Why would we expect them to show any restraint at all in the future when they've gotten every single thing they want?
Yeah, I agree with you, mate. The Trump administration is, at this point, I do think he's just deliberately giving into all of Putin's maximalist demands. There is you could talk about Ukraine not joining NATO again, which I sort of agree with, just because of certain, to protect the NATO project, the European project. I just think it's realistic. But there are other ways that you can shore up support for Ukraine, right? And Trump isn't bothering with any of that. And it shows, to be honest, to take a step back for a second, think about the engagement between the Russians and the Americans, right? This is not about Ukraine. Ukraine is but a component of a broader resetting of bilateral relations between the two, in a way that we haven't really seen done since Trump was in office, right? So, the US, again, it shows you the real priorities of the Trump administration. And so the nuclear element is something that he talks about World War III, but I don't actually think he's that fearful of it, because he's looking at Putin as a business partner, not as an adversary or just even head of state. My problem with Trump in many ways is that he approaches politics like business, and it just isn't like that. It really isn't driven by just business interests. It's driven by state interests, sure, but those aren't just based on business interests, right? And I think he simplifies it all.
I don't even like calling it business interests. I don't think as a businessman, I don't think we're making good deals. But also, real quick, someone said you're near Big Ben. Can you point to Big Ben? We need to see it.
Can I see Big Ben? I just saw it. I would have pointed it. I'm walking to Lancaster House, which is where they're holding the meeting.
God damn it.
All
right.
I'll walk. Okay, I'll walk back round. I was literally in front of Buckingham Palace and all that stuff. I can point it out to people if you want.
No, that's okay.
I mean, it's getting dark here, so you might, after a while, it'll just be a black camera of me talking to you. But if that's all right with you,
no, you're good.
I'm kidding.
Keep walking. You're good. You're good.
So no, anyway, but I wanted to ask you very simply. So, what would you think is the best approach to this then? Like, how do we push Russia to the point, but we can ensure that they won't resort to nuclear weapons? Because
I think
if you've got that answer, you should be running for president, mate.
Well, the issue right now, unfortunately, is I think we've already done irreparable damage to our relationship to the rest of the world, because how the fuck does the world look at the United States beyond being a schizophrenic country going from Obama to Trump to Biden to back to Trump? It's just insane. So whatever president we get next, even if it's a good president, it's just going to be crazy. Like, we're just so unreliable in terms of our foreign policy outlook. But I would say, and I might be biased coming off my Israeli history studying, but like, the best thing that you can do is to have a very strong no nonsense policy of, hey, you're not allowed to do this. And if you do this, the United States is going to come down on you with the force of 1,000 F-35s and obliterate whatever the fuck you're doing. And then that's your hard line right there. And if Russia wants to be like, whoa, yeah, we're gonna fucking nuke you, really? You're really going to do that? Is Putin going to stay in power? A guy who already was facing mutiny from Wagner, who, I don't know what his actual popularity numbers are, but for an economy that's been strained by war for 2 years on a country that it should have been able to defeat in 2 weeks, you're going to start pushing the nuclear button? Like, what do Chinese-Russian relations look like if Russia starts threatening nukes? Like, is that something that even the rest of, BRICS is going to be on board with? Is China going to be on board with that? Like, I don't know. I feel like the saber rattling is only done because other people give into it. But if the United States stops listening, I think that the next step is, this would be the thing I would say. What do you think would be more likely? Okay. The United States says, we changed our mind on Ukraine. We're doing a new no-fly zone. And those are our F-35s that now own that sky. And if you cross the border or if you shoot anything or whatever, you're getting bombed, okay? Do you think that from there, is it more likely that Putin says, well, fuck, I guess I just have to start nuking shit? Or does Putin go, wow, these horrible, disgusting Americans and the rest of the world have backstabbed us and they're turned against us and we have no choice but to leave, I guess, Ukraine. But I mean, the U.S. did this and it's their fault and they pull out of Ukraine. Like, what do you think is more likely in that point?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, because also, just before I answer, this is Lancaster House, or sort of one of the entrances. Further around there is where most of the vehicles would have been going through with the heads of state and delegations. Most of them have left at this point. They've got to get back across to Europe. And Zelenskyy, I believe, has already left. He's on the way to see King Charles for a meeting. So anyway, this is sort of where ground zero of today, and where Europe really needs to wake the fuck up. So. Yeah. To answer your question very simply, I think that is the million-dollar question, because if Putin were not to do something in response to that, then that's the end of his legitimacy as the president. Because
so just real quick on this point, because I want to hear you talk about this. I disagree with you, but only because, keep in mind, this is an offensive operation. I think that if NATO were attacking Russian territory, or if the U.S. was attacking like Russia proper, sure, but this is for a Russian invasion. They're just retreating from land that they're invading. Now, we can argue that they formally annexed parts of Ukraine. Fine, I don't know how much that matters.
Wait, back up. So are you talking about NATO actively being on the ground or in the air, so to speak, in Ukraine, managing the airspace much more like assertive offensively?
No. I'm saying that it would just be in Ukraine. It would be defensive Ukraine. I'm impossible believing that Putin would be firing nukes for offensive war against Ukraine.
No, of course he wouldn't. No, of course he wouldn't. I don't think the Kremlin would do anything in that instance. But again, that is existential for Putin, or nearing about as existential as you can get, because he is. It's about the legitimization of his regime. He's an autocrat, don't forget, and as much as people who shrill for him like to say that democracies are inherently stable, so are autocrats. If you don't have the keys of foundation or keys to power, your financiers, your military supporters, and your law enforcement or whatever, you are on shaky ground. And Putin has arguably been the most effective strongman, which is why he's lauded amongst so many others, like, well, even Netanyahu sort of sometimes, right, or Erdogan or Bolsonaro, and Trump arguably himself. It's because he's been the most successful person at purging his adversaries, his skeptics, denialists, whatever, that he remains so much in power.
I
And
agree.
so he
But
would.
imagine a deal where the U.S. says, no fly zone over Ukraine. Okay, no fly zone over Ukraine. Here's the deal. All right, if you want this to stop, you can have a 99-year lease for Sevastopol, so you can keep your port there and you can float your ships or whatever. But all the territory goes back to Ukraine. You get to have your lease on Sevastopol. All the sanctions go away. We'll unfreeze your funds or whatever. But this conflict is over. Like, I feel like that's a deal that, you know, Putin has to go back to Russia licking his wounds a little bit, but they get all their assets unfrozen. They get their sanctions lifted. Their economy starts to recover. His oligarchs are happy. You know, he can come away saying like, well, look at what at least he has some victory there that he can point to. Well, I got all these assets back from the European Union, from the Americans and everything else. And here we are, you know, into the future. Like, I don't know. That just seems so much better than letting Putin walk away with a big W from this war that justifies all of it. Now he's got 4 of these, if you count, you know, intrusion in Syria and everything, where he can point to like, well, look at these great Russian military interventions and everything. Well, I guess not Syria anymore because Assad is gone, but I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. So I think we should bring in that component as well, which is that if we need to take stock of where Russia is right now, which is, for whatever morons say Russia's winning, they're not. Strategically speaking, or grand strategically speaking, Russia is doing pretty bad. They've lost Assad. The Iranians are decimated from, well, Hezbollah, so they've lost their effects across the Middle East. North Korea is doing okay, I guess. I mean, not really much is happening over there. But the Russians are facing, you know, the economy is getting really bad. So Putin is not in an ideal position. And so his back is up against the wall quite a lot. And so if he then starts being, you know, even more pressured by the United States in terms of like, you know, look, we're going to enforce this no-fly zone. What are you going to do, punk? That is something I cannot really predict. I've studied Putin in Russian studies for a while, but to go to that extent, that might be the point where the Russians are like, well, maybe, you know, screw it. Ukraine is expendable.
Yeah,
because Putin has to sell it, you know what I mean?
Yeah. But Putin can sell it because at least he's got some offers from the West in terms of, well, here's what you get if you leave. But this would be the type of thing that only the United States could do, which I thought was a cool thing about my country. But right now, the United States is negotiating this peace deal like we're fucking Albania or whatever. Not to knock on the Albanians, but it's like, what, we have nothing to offer, no firepower, no show for it. I don't know. It just seems wacky to me.
Well, I'm curious on that point though, what you and your viewers think, right? About, because pro-MAGAs frame this as being sort of Trump is using common sense and a show of force. He's putting Zelenskyy in his place by treating him disrespectfully. He didn't say thank you enough times, right? But like, for anyone of a reasonable mind, it just looks incredibly defeatist. You are giving in to the demands when you run the most powerful economy. It's like, well, we don't want to spend any more money. Yeah, that's fair enough, but I don't understand how they try to frame it as though this is some kind of show of strength by the Trump administration.
Yeah, when we're just bullying the side that's already like the severe underdog and everything. Yeah, I don't know. It feels like having, like I said before, like having the U.S. as your ally, like that should be the ultimate fucking fear of the other side, that the U.S. has stepped in and has gotten involved, and now you're like, well, fuck me. Whereas right now, it's just like, it means nothing. Like the U.S. just wants to retreat from everything, or,
I guess I wouldn't. Let's be a little bit more. I'm going to start dancing around it a little bit more. I think that if the United States were to try to impose some kind of more concentrated, I don't know, no-fly zone, or more established, like sort of to push back against the Russians in a sort of more, focused effort, I don't think the Russians would actually respond. We've done that each time. Each time we've given the Ukrainians more. And I think the most recent example was October, November, when the Russians, you know, reviewed or revised their nuclear doctrine to basically make it easier for them to launch nukes or put them on high alert, which is, you know, that's not just rhetoric, it's a policy shift, however demonstrative it might be, but it's still more than just words. But I think if the US continue to apply the pressure up, more sanctions, more methods of trying to bring countries around to dissuade them from trading with Russia, for example, that would then, you know, the argument is that the Russian economy is about to implode or sort of
Mhm.
go down in the next year, but I don't know how much Ukraine can last that long, given the destruction from within the US towards them, as well as the pressure from Putin. So
Yeah, I think another
I
huge issue is, and I'm not studied on this at all. You would know a billion times more. But I think another issue is just that over the past 30 years, the United States doesn't seem to know what its relationship with Russia is, right? Like after like I think Gorbachev was trying to liberalize the Soviet Union quite a bit. The Soviet Union falls. Yeltsin is in and out. Putin is in and out. Like the war on terror happens and we start to get a lot closer to Russia security wise, but then they invade Georgia and we're not as sure. And it feels like the United States and Russia, I don't know if it's confusion on the US side, the Russian side, on both sides, if it's an international issue where other forces are at play, but it feels like the United States just hasn't made a firm decision on what is our relationship with Russia. How do we view each other and how should we proceed with that? And without that big question being solved too, it's also hard to figure out like, what does any future involving both of us look like?
Well, here I'm going to take a slightly different tone, maybe, but I
Mm-hmm.
do think that there has been an unnecessary demonization of Russia in the past. Not necessarily, but I forget Putin for a second, but like a lot of pop culture in the US, it's always, the Russians are the evil. They want to destroy the US and our way of life and freedoms and all that sort of stuff. And I do think that I don't know if you saw a talk given by a very prominent economist called Jeffrey Sachs relatively recently in the EU. And some people might hear that name and be like, oh, I don't like him. But he, I think, is quite reasonable in that he acknowledges that the West could have done maybe a better job of engaging Russia earlier on in this whole
Well, I mean, to
situation.
be fair, we just came off of like a 50-year whatever Cold War. Of course. I mean, come on. We all
Yeah,
watched
but
Rocky
still.
Four, whatever. We all did this. We saw the space race. Like, it's pretty hard to come off that and then be like, okay, cool, everything's chilled out. Like, there was a lot. I mean, I told you, my own parents are like big Red Scare people, and they talked about Chi-Com and the Soviets. Like, my mom called the Soviet Union up until like 10 years ago. She would still call Russia the Soviet Union, the Soviets, everything. So, to be fair, yeah, I mean, it's antagonistic. I agree for sure, but I think it's like understandably so.
Yeah, yes and no. I look. The US did try stuff. Americans who are pro Putin or the apologists often talk about not 1 inch further east because of NATO and this whole promise by Secretary James Baker, I think it was. But that is a false representation of history, because that's not what happened. There was never any. It was verbal, sure. They might have said some verbal stuff, but there was never any written guarantee.
Okay, not
And
only that, I'm glad you bring this up because I hate it when people bring that point up. That was referring to the militarization of East Germany if they did reunification. The idea that NATO wouldn't move any further east didn't make sense when Baker was speaking because there was nowhere east for NATO to even move to. The Warsaw Pact was still in effect and everything else. I think that had to do with the remilitarization of East Germany if they did reunification, which was a big concern. But people pretend that was some guarantee. That NATO would never expand. And I think even Gorbachev himself, I think, gave an interview saying, no, of course there was never like any written promise or guarantee or anything for that.
so here's a couple of more fun facts. So,
Mhm.
in 1997, Clinton's administration established the Founding Act with NATO, which was about trying to better establish, integration or interoperability through certain areas. In the 90s, NATO was a bit of I didn't know what it was going to be. It didn't have an identity anymore. The existence of the reason of its creation was no longer a thing. So,
Mhm.
and then in 2002, they created the Russian NATO Council. So these were effective steps by the US and allies to try to sort of, engage Russia
Normalized
more
relationship, yeah.
effectively. Yeah, but the other thing was also, Russia was integrated to NATO through what's known as the Partnership for Peace program. So this was an initiative with Ukraine as well, and technically they're both part of it. These ideas of talking about collective peace through, dealing with counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, counterinsurgency, whatever.
Mhm.
And Putin was actually, one of the first allies to say to George Bush when 9/11 happened, we're here to support you.
Yeah.
That, like, it's insane. And the very last point I make is also actually Russia applied to join NATO twice. First in 1954, it's the Soviet Union, and second as Russia in the late 90s/2000s, because Putin thought NATO would be a useful, counterbalance or vehicle by which to deal with the Chechenian uprisings in the late 90s in Chechnya and stuff. So the relationship there is completely more complex than people say. It's all about NATO expansionism and destruction of Russia. It's just rubbish. But where do we go from there? So
Yeah.
is it the end of NATO? What do you think?
Um, I mean, that's up to Putin, I think. I think Putin should just fire like 2 missiles into Poland, and I think NATO falls apart immediately because the United States is not doing anything. It doesn't feel like it, so who knows? Yeah.
What would you most like to see done then? What would you like Trump to do?
Would I like Trump die of a heart attack, I guess? I don't know. What I mean, he'd have to fall over and crush Vance on the way down, though. I mean, I don't know. I feel like the United States doesn't have a vision of itself in the world. I feel like the U.S. has a very negative view of itself. We used to have these competing ideas in the U.S. We had like our hawkish party on the right, the Republicans, who said U.S. police good, and then we had our like very far left people who were like the U.S. foreign policy, we're always bad. And now everybody switched over to that latter position where the right says, oh, true, U.S. foreign policy is bad, and now everybody just hates America in America. So obviously we don't see ourselves as having any kind of like moral justification for doing anything internationally. And I think that's
But
just
what do you identify it as? Like, are you are liberal, but like, are you a liberal interventionist? You believe in intervening in countries to encourage democracy? Are you more,
I don't believe about, I mean, I don't think we should intervene just for democracy, but I think in places where, like, the United States, I think, should have a very active involvement in European security. I think it's demonstrably been incredibly successful over the past 30 years. And the idea of just walking away from that for no reason, I think is incredibly silly and stupid. And for the cited reasons that Trump gives is even more stupid. The idea that Europe is scamming us with tariffs and all this stupid nonsense is just, yeah, it's ridiculous. It's just making a worse world for everybody in the West. And like you said, really the winner in all this is China is just sitting back and thinking like, ooh, okay, here we go, yeah.
Well, the biggest sort of winner is China, but the biggest sort of breath of fresh air or breathing space is Putin, obviously. The old quote that makes me think about NATO that a lot of Russians do feel about it is that sort of, it was created to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Soviets out. Right. And sort of to that extent, NATO has been incredibly effective. But again, the whole point being that the United States, whether you agree with it or not as a European, the US has been the de facto, well, de jure, really, actually, I guess, sort of, arbitrator of what happens in Europe. The US says if you don't do what we want in the security realm, we'll pull back. And so the Europeans will often capitulate or come to the support of the US after 9/11. So. And activate. That was the only time Article 5 has ever been activated for all the scaremongering from the MAGAs. It was because the US, Europeans activated it to show solidarity with the US in 2001. So it's bizarre. I don't know. I mean, and the last point I make actually is that the UK has a really important decision to make, which is, as I'm sure you saw, the Prime Minister gave a letter to Trump saying, you are given a unprecedented state visit, right?
I saw that, yeah.
I didn't want him to have one in the first place, but that's 6 years ago now. But to do it again, that's never happened before. It's unprecedented. It's the first time only we've ever done that. Why are we doing it? To try and placate Trump so he plays ball with us. And we're doing the typical thing UK of sucking up to the United States to the point where the head's so far up the arse. And it's sycophantic. But
but now for the UK, you guys have more pressure than ever. Because, oh shit, actually, I just realized this when you said that. Any tariffs that Donald Trump applies to the European Union don't apply to the United Kingdom, right? So the UK now has a huge incentive to suck up to Donald Trump. Yeah, because, yeah.
No, but it's more specific than that. What I'm getting at is that the US, the UK, has to either stop pretending like it is 100% with Ukraine in moralistic standing and, that what Trump did was terrible and keep the invitation, or actually stand by their comments that they are saying about Ukraine and rescind the invitation. Because if you don't do that, either way, you come off as a massive hypocrite and a complete, laughing stock. If Keir Starmer really wants to be seen as someone who adheres to what he's talking about, he cannot continue to offer the guy who's sold out Ukraine as much as he did a state visit. It goes against every principle that he's talking about. It's such double standards.
I mean, I guess, but I mean, if it comes down to, I mean, what is the EU going to punish the United Kingdom for having that visit? Probably not. But Trump is the kind of guy who, where like, if you pet his head, he's going to give you, the entire world as long as he thinks you think positively of him. So, I mean, I agree from a moralistic or from like a integrity, dignity, whatever standpoint, like it's disgusting. But I mean, I understand the incentive to do it because just Trump is so fragile.
It's literally values versus interests, right?
Sure.
And it goes back to what you were saying about the European defense thing. Like, whether you like Macron or not, I think he has a certain willingness to take risks. Like when he put his arm on Trump's hand on Trump's arm,
yeah,
right?
and he corrected him. Thank God, because American media is so fucking cowardly. They won't correct him on anything. I was so happy to see Macron call him out for that and say, "Excuse me, we've given more money than you have."
We need more leaders like that, man.
Yeah.
And Starmer wasn't willing to do that. If you saw the way that Starmer stood in the portrait of the White House when he first arrived, he's like huddled over like little sort of geography teacher with those glasses. Trump's over there like giving him the big, look and stuff. And it's just like Keir just comes off so feeble. I like Macron more because at least he tries to hold stature. It's like when you see them shaking hands, right? Macron always grabs Trump's shoulder and keeps him at a distance because Trump likes to pull people towards him using his body weight.
Yeah,
to make
Trudeau
them
did
fall
that
off.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, I like that. So, I don't know, but I do think that a European military isn't necessarily off the cards. Europe has the capacity. We have the know-how. We have the capital. What we lack is coordination and an ability to get shit together. If we can't somehow better align what we need to do and be committed to that, even if it means taking risks or ostracizing certain countries like Hungary who want to pull us back, then, we might have to do that. But I just don't know if the European leaders have a conviction enough for that. So anyway, you should move to Europe. I think you'd find yourself more at home here. Where are you actually at the moment?
I live in Miami.
Oh, wow. That's not a,
I stay inside all day, so it doesn't, yeah. But all right, well, any final closing thoughts for us? This might be the last time communications are even open between our countries, so.
Well, I mean, it's been fun. I'm actually almost at home, so I was going to switch over to my laptop so you can actually have a stable picture instead of my chin and my ear or your whatever viewers. Sorry about that.
Well, this is good. As Americans, we don't walk much, so it's nice to see you, out and about.
You got secondary anxiety or secondary exercise.
Yeah, secondary exercise. Yeah, there we go.
No, I guess, my lasting thoughts, at the end of the day, I think that Europe has to put itself first in a way that we maybe haven't done long enough. We need to be more strategic and shameless in how we do that. At the end, I like America in principle. I am frustrated by certain things. I don't really think the Second Amendment is that necessary in the 21st century, for example. But, we're so far in now, to the point that, as I said before, Americans are hating Europe and everything about it, and it's a socialist, communist cesspit of, leftist, whatever they call them, brain rot. That they, it's very sad to see, and I think the only way that the American MAGA at least are going to realise how bad this is turning out for them is when it's too late, and a fair amount of self-sabotage is going to have to occur before, I watched a video by Adam Conover, I think it was yesterday, and he's very left, and I don't necessarily agree with everything, but he made one very, I think, pertinent point, which is there's more you can do than simply just, going and speaking or ringing up your representative. Get out there, find an organization or create your own, get active, right, in terms of political activism, and go and badger the hell out of institutions and places of official, whatever, your local town hall or council, right? That's what you can still do. And it's, it's about us not saying go and riot necessarily, but do what the people did on the streets in Vermont. That's exactly what needs to continue to do. And that's what I think Americans are really good at. And often the British don't do. We're not aggressive enough in standing up for the values that we appreciate. And those values are being eroded by the likes of Musk, Trump, and Vance. So, yeah, I hope that, we're going to have to weather the storm for the next 4 years. And you and I are going to be very busy. So I hope we can reconvene and do this again. It was great fun. Thanks.
Hopefully, yeah. Thanks a lot for chatting. Yeah, see me whenever. And yeah, good luck. Thanks for the exercise. And yeah, have a good one, man.
Yeah, well, yeah, you can find me on my channel if people want to follow me on what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, we'll do this again. Yeah. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Have a good one, man. Bye.